Hey, good morning. It's Pastor Doug here to study with you in the Gospel of Mark. We are all the way into the 8th chapter, picking up in verse 27. We'll be reading to the end of the chapter. This is an important part, whatever we get, what we have come to call the Great Confession. But it comes right before the Great Rejection, which we also have to talk about as well. But this is from the New American Standard Version, picking up in verse 27. We'll read it together, and then we'll come back and sort of study our way through it. Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets." He continued by questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of God must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be rejected and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." He summoned the crowd and said, and with his disciples, and said to them, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels." Not a long passage, so we'll probably have a little shorter study here together. But this is an important part, one that touches all of us, because we have to find ourselves with those disciples facing that same question. These disciples had been living with Jesus, walking with him, going on this travel, seeing amazing miracles, signs that he's the Son of God. They're hearing people and what they're saying. They're seeing how Jesus responds to them, how he responds to them, the disciples. They've been taking it all in. And remember, they'd just come across the ocean. They'd come up to the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, and they make their way to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. It says just Jesus went out along with the disciples to the villages up that direction. Caesarea Philippi is probably, depending on how you look at it, a lot of the Bible commentaries say it was about 25 miles north and a little bit to the east of the top of the Sea of Galilee, maybe about 40 miles south of Damascus. If you were to get one of those Bible maps and just put a little pinpoint and draw a straight line, it'll say it was about 15 miles, but it goes up into the mountains. And so it is a location that is well known, and one where people have been living for a very long time. It got its name, Caesarea Philippi, the first part from Tiberius Caesar, the second part from Philip Antiochus. Used both of their names to honor him. It was one of those locations that whenever the Caesars did bring their armies, they went from the Caesarea on the Sea of the Mediterranean and up and across the way of the sea, and they would come all the way out to Caesarea Philippi. It was originally called Pania, after the god Pan. There was a cave up in that area where they worshipped Pan, and it was called Panera. Not to be confused with Panera Bread, but just letting you know, sort of that all kind of name. They worshipped this Greek god up in that area. And then it became overrun. It became converted. It got different names whenever the Romans came in. And it would gradually kind of go back. If you look at it today, it's now called Benaiah because the Arabics can't say peace very well. At least that's what it says in the commentaries. And so that's how it's got its new name. Still has that name after the Greek god, which is kind of sad. I guess they made their choice, and it wasn't the right one. In Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, as they were going to these villages that were up in that area, just as they'd gone out to the villages of the Galilee area, he was questioning his disciples using that Socratic method, asking them something, seeing what their response is, what they know, and just says, well, what do people say about me? What are they talking about whenever they talk about Jesus? Because Jesus knew the answer, so he wasn't asking for himself, but he's wanting his disciples to process it. And there's something about facing a question, especially one that's spoken out loud. It's one thing to have the answer, someone speak it and affirm it, and quite another to be put on the spot, and you've got to actually speak up and say, well, this is what they're saying. And they were saying lots of things. We get from verse 28 that they were saying, well, maybe he was John the Baptist. You know, John the Baptist had died. He'd been put to death already. We heard that story. And there were some who think that maybe he was resurrected. There were some ideas that some of the prophets of old would be resurrected and preach again, especially one who's going to come in the spirit of Elijah. They didn't realize that that was John the Baptist and he fulfilled his role. But so people were still a little confused about all that, and don't blame them. Sort of an odd concept. But they're saying, well, maybe Jesus was John the Baptist. Others were saying, well, maybe he's Elijah. Maybe he's the one that's coming in the spirit of Elijah rather than John the Baptist being the one. They just didn't want to go to where Jesus was claiming. Maybe they said, maybe just one of the other prophets. Not a new prophet, but one of those old prophets. So they are sort of thinking this end time kind of concept. They were thinking that God was at work and was at work in Jesus, moving them toward that restoration that was promised. So they're starting to get an inkling of who Jesus is. Still a lot of confusion. And there's a lot of confusion today, especially as we move towards celebrating Easter. There are all kinds of stories on the internet and going to be in news articles and on social media where people are going to say this or that about Jesus. And they're just going to say all kinds of stuff. It is, to me, always a little bit interesting, especially when they say, oh, the real Jesus. And when you start reading it, you're going like, that's not really the real Jesus. If you really want to know the real Jesus, you have to go to his word. The word that his people proclaimed. That's the only source for knowing the real Jesus. The rest of it, just a hodgepodge of man's ideas rather than a sure gospel and testimony of the life and times of Jesus, which we have in each of these accounts, and especially as we go through this good news from Mark. He is saying that these people were that way. And so he pushes it a little further from what are they saying to what do you say? And see, that's it. Those of us who know Jesus and follow Jesus, those of us who see him at work and have experienced him, we think a little differently than the world around us, even if they're paying pretty close attention. And so they come in here and, good for Peter, right? He may struggle every now and then, but this is good for him. He speaks up. He is bold. He blurts out. And better to make a mistake if you're going forward than not making anything by keeping your tongue. And so he says, well, you are the Christ. Now, Christus is the term for anointed. Anointed was this was sort of the Greek way that they would talk about the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. This was a title of the servant that God would raise up, the one that Isaiah spoke about in chapters 48 through 50 and beyond. Those servant psalms that he had there, and so they were looking forward to God raising up someone who was coming to save them. And Peter says, you are the Messiah. And then we get this, what's come to be called the Messianic Secret. He, being Jesus, warned them, not just Peter, but all of them, to tell no one about him. Now that's a little odd for someone who has been setting his disciples apart, sending them out into the villages of the Galilee, coming back, and they're giving these great reports of the things that are going on. They've been witnessing the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000, the evil spirits being cast out, and they finally get the right thing. You're the Christ, and he says, "That's it. Don't tell anyone that. That you are dead right. Keep your mouth shut." What's going on, Jesus? Why don't you want them to talk? Well, there's lots of explanations of why. Not really any good answers other than sort of that ecclesiastical attitude of saying, well, there's a time to speak, and there's a time to be quiet. Part of the time to be quiet is so that Jesus can do what God wants him to do, and no one gets in the way of it. You know, if you knew that someone was the Christ, but you had a misconception about the Christ, you might not want them to do what the Christ had come to do, like Peter. And we get that story as we move on a little bit. He began to teach them. So this is a teaching time for his disciples, that the Son of Man, and the Son of Man is a messianic prophet. We get it showing up as one like the Son of Man in the clouds in Daniel's words. So when he says that the Son of Man, he's talking about the Christ, the Messiah. They're all using interchangeable words for Jesus. And he says, hey, whatever you got going on, thinking about the Christ, thinking about me, you need to understand, guys, that the Son of Man has to suffer. Now, they hadn't been doing much suffering. Yeah, they had to walk a lot. They had to watch a lot. There's some physical little things, but he's using a word here, pasak, which means to serve. This gets used of what we come known as the Passover lamb. When we talk about, the Passover, the lambs that were put to death, or the blood on the door, so that the death angel would go over. There's a suffering that the Son of Man is going to have to do. And not only is he going to have this suffering, but he has to get rejected. And it's really a pretty good translation, disapproved of, disallowed, not allowed to be in the right place, rejected. Brian, the presbyteros, not to be confused with the Presbyterians, although they are elder-led and they get their name from the same word. But the Jewish leaders of synagogues, the presbyters, the chief priests, and those are the ones who were kind of above even their level of the elders, the scribes. And not only is he supposed to be suffering, but they're going to kill him. And the word Jesus is used for killed is unmistakable, apokateno. It is to put to death. This is a word that is not just kill, but murder. And after 3 days, rise. Well, I like the New American Standard, rise again. The again isn't in the original, but after 3 days, he's going to rise. Rejected, put to death, rise again. That's the gospel message right there, that Jesus is plainly speaking to them. In fact, that's what Mark says. He said he just started speaking plainly to us. Evidently, the disciples, like everyone else, can be a little hard-headed. And what better way to dispel bad ideas than to speak plainly to someone? And that's what Jesus did to his own disciples. And it was so plain that Peter's like, time out here, Jesus. Do you understand what you're talking about? Do you understand what you're saying? And Peter actually takes Jesus aside and rebukes Jesus. So after the great confession, Peter gives Jesus the great rebuke. Yeah, you are the Christ, but Jesus, man, don't you understand what that means? After Jesus had just been explaining it to Peter. But turning around and seeing the other disciples watching this exchange, he, Jesus, rebukes Peter. So an even greater rebuke, but this time from Jesus to Peter. And he says in this rebuke, you get behind me. Doesn't say get behind me in the idea of to follow, but to get behind me as in to get out of the way. And he refers to Peter as Satan. There's probably no more humbling expression that Jesus could have used to get Peter's attention. He says, you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. And that's when Satan has us. Paul would talk in 2 Corinthians about us giving a place for the devil in our lives, even as born-again Christians, even of those like Peter who are following him. And when we give a place for Satan, then we think his thoughts, which are lies, falsehoods, and we end up acting his way, which are the opposite of what God would have us do. And sometimes we just let our ideas of peace and prosperity and happiness and warm fuzzies get in the way of sometimes where God calls us. Now, most of us want God to call us to somewhere cushy and comfortable and nice and easy and all the blessings. But here's Jesus, the Son of God, being called to death. A death that would lead to the opportunity to show his greatness in the resurrection, but a path that led through suffering and the cross before he came to the grave. Sorry about not turning off my alarm there, but I'll go ahead and get that turned down so we don't get others probably some really great important thing. You know how that is. I usually say turn them off, but left mine on, so I'm the guilty party here. Sorry about interrupting our study. So here we go with this, and they just are dumbfounded at Jesus's rebuke. But man, that can come to all of us. It's easy for us to get the wrong idea about who Jesus really is and what he is calling us to, because it's not a place we want to go. He then summons the crowd that had been gathering in these villages that are up in the Caesarea Philippi area, because wherever he went, there were people coming out of need for him primarily. And he brings his disciples with them, and he begins to tell the crowd, these people who don't know him like the disciples know him, this crowd of people who aren't really sure who he is. Is the Christ? Maybe he's a prophet, John the Baptist. You know, they're kind of confused. But he calls these confused people this truth. If you want to come after me, and this is that term for following now. If you want to follow me, aletheia, if you want to go after, come out after me, you're going to have to deny yourself. You know, our self doesn't want to be inconvenienced. Our self doesn't want to give up comfort. Our self is going to pull us back. And he says that you will have to take up your cross in order to follow me. I just taught in a sermon last week about this word, akoulitheu, that it's a post-positive word that's at the front of it that means that whatever the rest of the word is, we're going to share it together. And the rest of the word is the word way. And so when Jesus says, follow me, he says, get on the same road that I'm on. If you want to be on the same road that I'm on, you need to understand that my road goes through the cross. Man, we don't like to hear that. We like, throwing around the phrase, well, that's my cross to bear. But man, when we look at it like Jesus looks at it, it's not something to make fun of. We're talking about a path that leads us to being rejected, and we don't like being rejected. We don't like being called names. We don't like the world hating us and wishing that we were dead, and thinking that life would be better if they could just get rid of us. See, that's the way of the cross. Those leaders, those respected people, those ones who thought they were gods, they want to get rid of Jesus. They want to get him out of the way. And if you're following Jesus, they're going to feel the same way about you. They're going to want you to get out of the way. They're going to want to silence you. And man, we've got to take up and follow. And it may lead just where it led Jesus, to suffering. It might even lead to our death, but it will also lead to our resurrection, just as his life was led that way. That's why Jesus told this crowd, man, whoever wishes to save his life, if your instincts start taking over and you stop following me because it's too hard, it's too difficult, there's too much danger, then you're going to end up losing your life. But if you end up losing your life by following me, man, you're going to save it. And that word for save, sozo, to make complete, to make whole. You'll finally get to where I'm going. And Jesus returned home to the Father. He's with the presence of God, and that's where we want to be when all things are said and done as well. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Man, we sometimes struggle with that question, but we shouldn't. What would you rather have, heaven or happy life on earth? Most of us would say, I just want both. I want a happy life on earth and I want heaven. In fact, I just want God to give me everything here and make life beautiful and wonderful. And in fact, that's how I know that I'm really following Jesus, because I just have blessing after blessing after blessing. I just have more and more and more. And I get to have my cake and eat it too. But that's not what Jesus told his disciples. He says, get behind me, Satan. You don't want what God wants. You're just thinking like a man, what a man wants. And you're in the way. You need to get out of my way so I can do what God wants. And I would love for you to come follow me and take up your cross too. He says that to Peter. He says this to the disciples. But man, he says it to the whole crowd, which means he might be saying it to you and me. What will a man give in exchange for a soul? Man, you're down to your last breath. What do you give for heaven? I mean, if you could buy it, if you could earn it, I mean, it doesn't work that way. It's a gift, a free gift from God. But if you could purchase heaven, if you could make a deal for eternity, would you give everything for it? Would you seek it like the pearl of great price, or the field with the hidden gold, the treasure? Hope that you would give everything for it. Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, and if you're that way, Jesus says, when I come back, I'm going to be that way about you. Sometimes we talk about the golden rule, that we want to be others to treat us as we treat them. And that's what Jesus is saying. I'm going to treat you like you treat me. I'd rather have grace. I want Jesus to treat me better, because I'm a screw up and a muck up, and my flesh gets in the way, and I don't always do like I want to do. And so I have to call for forgiveness and to be set free. And when Jesus shows up again, I want to hear his name. I want to hear, good and faithful, well done, servant. I want to be faithful. I want to have taken up my cross and followed him. I don't like the prospect of suffering, but neither did Jesus. In the garden, he wept. He says, God, if there's just any other way for me to do this, then take this cup away. But instead, he follows. And he sees it through the suffering and the death to the glory of the resurrection. And we will too. That's the end of our study. Son of Man is going to be coming with the Father and his holy angels, and we want that to be a day of celebration. Hopefully, if you enjoyed our study of the Gospel of Mark, as we continue on, we'll pick up in the 9th chapter next week. I hope that God blesses you and that he challenged you through his word today to follow him. We'll see you next week. God bless.